I want to talk with you for a second about an idea whose time I think has come, and that is considering universal exposure. When we were talking about what makes something traumatic a little while ago, chances are you might have thought, oh wow, yeah, Is there anybody who hasn't been exposed to something traumatic? Now, I want you to understand that it's seeing, hearing, or experiencing. So if you have seen something that didn't impact you directly, like the near miss this morning when I was on my way to the airport, nobody got hurt. But had someone gotten hurt, had that car plowed into other cars, I would have witnessed something that may well have been traumatizing to me. Had I heard that crash, it might have been traumatic. So it's not just the direct experience of it happening to me, it can be seeing or hearing it for other people. What happens if we assume universal exposure? Is anyone harmed if we assume that everyone may well have been overwhelmed by something that they saw or heard or experienced? I don't think so. The other thing that assuming universal exposure allows us to do is focus on how we can strengthen our own skills for being resilient. For example, one of the best public health studies ever done, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, asks people to consider whether or not they've ever experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, witnessed domestic violence between their father and their mother or their caregivers, whether or not they had a parent or caregiver who was so drunk or high they thought they couldn't take care of them as a child, whether or not they had a parent or caregiver who was incarcerated, or whether or not a parent or caregiver was absent for any reason before age 18. All of these have long-term impact on physical health. If it impacts our physical health, what does it do to our heart and our soul and our brain and our mind? Universal impact allows us to focus on creating a different level of empathy and kindness and compassion with each other that can only help everybody. Some of us aren't so lucky. Some of us grow up in environments where there might be physical poverty. Please don't confuse doing without money as doing without love. Just because a family doesn't have a lot of money doesn't mean that a person is traumatized. If that were the case, what would we say then about those rich family experiences among people in countries like India, or perhaps on those places that are now reservations for Native Americans, where there are a great number of cultural and intergenerational traumatic experiences, yet the love is strong and good and helps people be resilient? So universal exposure is something to consider. Looking at the little T's and the big T's and more than just the 9 or 10 things that are part of the adverse childhood experiences is important, because what traumatizes you may not traumatize me. It's the reaction to the event that causes it to be defined as traumatic. And if we consider that everyone has been overwhelmed, then we have a better chance of living out of love in a way that is helpful to all people. Now, when I was young, I grew up with what's called the medical model of illness, and that taught me that any time there was someone who had behavior that was problematic, that they probably had what we might call a mental illness, or they were just a bad young'un. As I grew up and began to pursue my own health, I discovered that this whole notion of something about the medical model, that it was a problem with my brain or a problem with somebody else's brain if they couldn't behave or function the way we wanted them to. The problem with that is that there aren't any biological tests that show us what might be a, quote, mental illness, close quote, or not. You can't get a lab test for post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress of any sort. You can't do a swab or an imaging study to find out if you've got depression. Most of the things that require brain biopsies require them after death. Now, over time, we might find the impact of traumatic experiences and how it changes how different connections are formed in the brain in terms of neural networks and the whole networking process. But this is still about connections and how they are formed. I came to believe in a state-dependent learning model that talks about developmental processes. For example, because I had physical disabilities when I was a child that caused my joints to dislocate, they still do, but I've had a lot of experience dealing with it by now. For me, I was so busy wondering when I was going to wake up with a knee out of place or a hip out of place, or I would be playing on the playground and I would be thrown to the ground by this, that I was missing some things developmentally. I was too busy doing one thing to do something else. If you think about youth in foster care, they have some of the same kind of experience. Something really difficult happened that caused them to be unable to stay at home. And from the time they were taken out of their home or left home until they moved in on their own somewhere, they were so busy surviving, they missed a lot of developmental stuff. How people act in different social situations, how to get the things that we need and want with behavior that's more comfortable for everybody, how to catch, as my mother might say, more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. It doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter what your experiences have been. If you've been so overwhelmed by something that happened to you at any age that you couldn't pay attention to other things, then the developmental model of this thing that we call mental illness, or the ways in which we are unable to cope, might be more effective than looking at a brain-based model of mental illness for you. Here's another reason I think that's so important. And of course, over time I could be proven wrong. About 3 weeks ago, someone showed me a little video clip on neurogenesis. That's Neurogenesis. And it showed a new neural network, a new connection forming in 20 seconds. So if people have experienced something traumatic, and in 20 seconds they formed a neural connection that's not going to serve them as well as another one might, guess what? We know that we can make new ones as long as we have breath in us. And so I believe that learning is a better model for considering the impact of traumatic experiences and how they change our lives, and how we can change our lives again, than looking at a brain-based model of mental illness. Sometimes people have things that are biological that cause them to behave differently. They might have inflammation. A great book to look at this is called Brain on Fire. They might have a form of encephalitis. They could have syphilitic lesions. They could have other things that cause them to behave in ways that are really uncomfortable and off-putting. They could have all kinds of toxic chemical buildups that we know about. But those are neurological problems. Those are not the things we call mental illness, even though the symptoms cross over. And I think as we continue to untangle what may be social, what may be nature, what may be nurture, we might find ourselves looking at different definitions in different ways.